I could not have said that better myself. This is Dark Cloud 2 on the PS2. And while there are many games on the PS2, I mean, come on, I shouldn't have to tell you that, that's part of what makes the system so cool. Dark Cloud 2 is one of 2 games I would ever entertain the thought of calling the best on the system. Right up there with the legendary Steambot Chronicles. Now the story is this. You play some rich kid named Max, who is apprenticing as an inventor. Now Max lives in a town called Palm Brinks. It's a completely walled off city, and this is important because it's the only intact piece of civilization left on the planet. And yet none of the inhabitants seem to know this. Some guy named Emperor Griffin has gone out and basically destroyed the world. And Max, now being hunted by Griffin's men because of an antique he inherited, now must explore the world and try and figure out what happened. Along the way, he is joined by Monica, a girl from the future, who seems to have a greater idea of the events occurring. Griffin is actually destroying the present in order to affect the future. It's now up to the two of them to try and fix the present and ultimately save the future and defeat Griffin. Now the story itself isn't bad by any means, but I've certainly played games with a lot better plot. I think that the story in this game is really the low point. But again, that said, it's actually not too bad, aside from 1 or 2 bumps along the way. I think what really sells it are the characters. I mean, yes, you've got your generic villagers, and yes, your main characters are just a generic boy and a generic girl, sorta. There's tons of wacky other characters in this game that totally make this game its own and a completely memorable story, despite the fact that the story itself isn't the most wildly unique. But before we get any further into this review, I think I want to handle the negatives, because if I don't do that up front, well, it's going to be me gushing about how awesome this game is pretty much till the end. I'm willing to admit that right now. So, negatives. I'm sure there were some. One of the main villains, when you defeat him, they try and humanize him, but it's done in such a clumsy way that it just makes his character confusing. There's weapon degradation. That's kind of annoying. I'm not a big fan of weapon degradation. So yeah, that's kind of crap. Oh, and there is stuff that can be permanently missable if you're not paying attention. But, beyond that, I'm pretty sure this game is pretty much awesome in every other respect. Now, the core gameplay in Dark Cloud 2 is a randomly generated dungeon action RPG. It's your standard hacky, slashy, dodgy, blocky affair, and I think it works really well for the most part. It's a bit button mashing heavy, but it works for what it needs to do. And despite it being basically just button mashing, there's actually a lot of strategy to it. Let's look at it this way. Dark Cloud 1 had like 8 characters. And while it's been quite a few years since my copy was stolen and I really played it, as I recall, each character felt more or less like just a different weapon. They all played relatively the same. But in Dark Cloud 2, while you only have 2 characters, it feels like they were developed completely differently. I mean, yes, they're both button mashing characters with a close and ranged attack, but the way they go about combat is completely different. So the first of your 2 characters, Max, has a hammer which inflicts heavy smashing damage. However, it's a relatively slow weapon to wield. Likewise, his ranged weapon is a gun, which is mostly useful for attacking aerial enemies, but it is kinda hard to hit with at range, and the farther away you get from your opponent, the less damage you'll do. Now, despite being a princess from the future, Monica is not just some trophy thing to collect at the end of the game to say you won. In fact, out of the 2 characters, she's probably the one who's going to be doing the most ass-kicking. She fights with a sword which attacks much faster and has a lot more range than Max's wrench. And her ranged attack is a bracelet which automatically homes in on its opponent and already has elemental damage applied to it, which can give you an edge on certain enemies. To further distance the 2 characters' similarities, they each have a transformation. Max has the Ride Pod. This game's obligatory inanimate object named Steve, of course referencing the talking slingshot from the original Dark Cloud, and Rogue Galaxy's Yuri Lowenthal bot, Steve is a customizable steampunk mech that pretty much one-shots everything. In fact, while I say Monica is probably the better of the 2 characters in terms of combat, The ride pod is definitely what makes Max's transformation way better than Monica's. Because Monica, she gets monster transformations, which feel like an afterthought because, well, you can turn into a monster, you can talk to them, you can use their abilities, but they all feel fairly weak, and are just kinda crap. Like, you can easily get through the entire game without ever worrying about them, except for that one bit that tutorializes them so you use it once. Aside from that, you don't ever have to do it again, and I don't think I ever have because it's never seemed useful. Now, outside the two characters' individual combat strengths, they also share some skills, such as the ability to use the environment to their advantage. They can pick up rocks and other debris and throw them at their opponents. You can block to negate most damage, not all, but most. As well, you can pick up enemies and throw them at other enemies to damage both, as well as knock them down, making them easier to hit. This is a very useful technique, except you can't do it against the really big enemies that you definitely need a leg up on if you haven't fueled up the ride pod. Always fuel up the ride pod is the lesson of this story, is basically what I'm saying. But the point is, combat works well, it flows very well. You've got an auto lock-on function, which is actually an intelligent auto lock-on function. The only thing I don't like about the basic combat in this game is once you've locked onto your opponent, you slow down a little bit. You move at like half speed, which I'm guessing is like a precision thing, but it just felt more annoying to me than anything. Now, outside of combat, the main focus of dungeon crawling can be distilled into this. Enter a dungeon, kill the random enemy that has the key to leave, and then find the Geo-stone, which is an important pickup that I'll talk about later. While this does initially seem like a very simple exercise, the enemies do change every couple of floors, and they do get progressively stronger and stronger and require different tactics to beat. Outside of this basic level-by-level goal, each level also has a series of 4 challenges. The first challenge is to beat the level under X amount of time, which is basically just a time trial to beat all the enemies as fast as you possibly can. The second goal is a Spheda goal, which is a minigame that you don't unlock until Chapter 3, but it's kinda like golf. And while the only instance of golf I've ever been interested in was Ninja Golf on the Atari 7800, and yes, that is in fact a thing, Spheda is actually a lot of fun. Basically, you are given a golf ball and a giant floating vortex of doom, either of which are color-coded as blue or red. Every time the ball bounces, it will swap from one color to the next. Your goal is to sink the ball into the hole while it's the opposite color, and if you manage to do so, you get a prize. The third goal is a fishing goal, which requires you to run around the randomized dungeon, find a fishing spot, and try and catch the biggest fish you possibly can. And the last goal is always a level-specific goal, but it always has to do with combat. Something like, beat all the enemies without healing, or beat all the enemies with Monica's monster transformation, and I'm just gonna spoil it for you right now, you're probably not ever getting that one. I'm just saying, monster transformations, awful. Now the point of these extra goals is not only to challenge the player and extend replayability, which it does quite nicely, but they also give you collectible medals. You can then turn these medals in for exclusive items, such as costumes, or alternatively, a thing that will change the name of your weapon. So instead of Max's Battle Wrench, you could in fact, and indeed I have, named it Max's Ass Smasher. On a much more nefarious scale, you could name your weapon after an actual weapon in the game, and then transform it into that weapon. I'm not sure if that's a glitch or was intentional, but kind of a neat way to get endgame items somewhat earlier. Now, outside of dungeon crawling, you of course have the Geo-rama, the system that made the original Dark Cloud so well known. Essentially, you are given this giant floating fortress which can plop down various pieces of environment, both natural and man-made, in order to create a settlement. If this settlement meets specific requirements, the future will then change. And this is a requirement for most of the story bits, but by 100% completing the future, you end up unlocking bonus stuff as well. Now, how do you know what these goals are? Well, remember those geostones I mentioned from the dungeon crawling? That's where these come in. Once geostones are introduced, every single geostone collected will either unlock a new condition in order to complete the future, or a new piece of environment to put down to affect the change. Although, I guess here would be where I would say there is another somewhat downside to the original Dark Cloud, which I guess is 2, like, maybe? And that is, again, it's been a while since I played the original Dark Cloud, but it feels like the Geo-rama here, in order to create a better future, feels a little bit more restrictive than it did in Dark Cloud 1. To further Geo-rama, you also have to recruit various citizens from Palm Brinks. It is the last settlement, which means they're the only source of new inhabitants you can get. Now, in order to recruit these settlers, you have to do various challenges. Some, it's as easy as simply talking to them. Others, it's as annoying as having to level up a weapon into a specific weapon. And the 2 characters that make you do that are the worst. That said, getting all the various recruitable settlers is a fun and rewarding experience, and once they join you, not only do they affect your Geo-rama, and are required in most cases to make a better future, but you can actually have them in your party at the same time, and they'll give you additional boosts, like getting more money from enemies, or slowing down weapon degradation. It's definitely not something worth ignoring, because they do help you in combat quite a lot, even if it's just in the background numbers. Now, I've talked about Geo-rama and I've talked about dungeon crawling, but I think the biggest strength of Dark Cloud 2 was the biggest strength of Steambot Chronicles as well. That this game just has so much stuff in it. Like, I'm not even sure where to begin with this one. Leveling. This game does not have a traditional leveling system. Your characters themselves do not ever functionally level. If you want to improve them, you have to find stat building items, which you can only get by building a better future. You can find 2 sets of items. The first set, known as Fruits of Eden, will increase your character's overall health. The other item is character specific. Max gets potato pies, Monica gets witch parfaits. As they eat that, you'll increase your defense. And while those are character specific, the Fruits of Eden aren't. So you could potentially just stock up on one character and just make them the most built tank ever, but you don't ever want to do that, and I'm just going to end it there. While you can do it, that's a really, really terrible idea. Now, beyond that, there is a leveling and experience system in this game. Every enemy you kill will drop these little blue beads. When you collect them, whatever weapon you use to kill your opponent will gain experience. If you feel one character is getting too much experience and the other is lagging behind, you can kill it with one character, then swap to your other, and the experience will be distributed equally between that character's equipment, which is a very helpful thing to know. I'm just going to say that right there. Now, every time your gear levels up, it gains Spectrum points. And what Spectrum points are points that allow you to apply essences of other items to your weapons. For example, if I had, say, I don't know, a water bottle, I could spectrumize it and turn it into like a sort of elemental ghost version of it, and then put it to Max's gun, which would then increase one of its stats. Now, this doesn't sound all that terribly impressive, but by building your stats up enough, you can then transform your weapons into stronger weapons. And outside of that maybe name-changing glitch, it's the only way to get the better weapons in the game. You can't simply find or buy them. Well, you can find them, but they're super, super rare. And even then, kind of a dice roll whether you get them or not. Likewise, if you spectrumize enough points into one stat onto your weapon can then take on that affinity. Like, say if Monica's sword had a really, really exceptionally high amount of ice damage, it would then start dealing a lot of ice damage, and then would start applying ice effects to enemies, and then enemies that are weak to ice would take a stupid amount of damage from it. Sometimes status afflictions are involved because of this too, which makes it kind of an interesting system. But because every time you level, it's harder to level your weapons, and every time you level, you only get X number of points, you have to spend them very wisely. Do you focus on building up to the next weapon that you want, getting you to your final weapon sooner, or do you simply build up your weapon's attack so you do more damage? It's your call, and it's kind of an interesting system because it's entirely based on you, how your weapons grow. Now, the ride pod is a little bit different, because while it gains experience, you then have to take it to its mechanic to build the base core. Once the core is built up, you can then apply different pieces of equipment to it. These pieces of equipment all have a certain point value, which will reduce the amount of equipment points that the core can hold. So you kind of have to strategize how much gear you want to staple to your ride pod to make it as badass as possible. And there is a bit of a problem here. By the end of the game, if you've completely maxed out your ride pod and you have all the best pieces of equipment, you won't be able to equip all of them. That is annoying. Now beyond the kind of interesting leveling system in this game, there's tons of other stuff to do. Now beyond that, there's also photography, and this is more than just a passing hobby in this game. Photography is a key mechanic that's actually required in order to do relatively well in this game. Max gets a camera very early on, and then he can run around and just take pictures of anything. Enemies, bosses, villagers, random pieces of debris on the road, and all of these things will give him ideas. You can then move these ideas to his idea book, and then these ideas can then be turned into inventions, which can be built and then used as either weapons, easier or cheaper ways to get various supplies, or other important gear that you might need during the game. It's a very deep and complex system, and the biggest problem with photography is the fact that if you want to photograph every single thing in this game, and there's a reason to, you're going to have to be very diligent because there's a lot of stuff like specific bosses, or in one unfortunate case, when I did get all the bosses, there is something you have to photograph in a late chapter that requires you to functionally screw up, and if you don't, and you don't take a photo of it, you've missed it forever. That sucks. A lot, unfortunately. And while that's quite unfortunate, there is a point to trying to get every single photo, because there's a character in the game that rewards your diligence in photography. You'll get more and more better rewards from him the more photos you take and the higher photography level you get. Beyond photography, I've already mentioned Sfida, and I've briefly glanced on this, but fishing is actually kind of a neat thing, because you get a fishing rod by about Chapter 2, and you can fish out of pretty much any source of water in the game. You can then take your fish, and either spectrumize them for your weapons, cook them, or you could put them in a fish tank, and try and breed them together to create a stronger fish. You can then take this stronger fish and enter them into a fishing tournament, where the fishes compete to see who the best fish is ever, I guess. And while all of these things sound so absurd, the large overarching point is every single thing you do, no matter how minute or how much it seems like a side objective, will reward you. And that's what gives this game such an insane replayability. There's just so much stuff here. Perspective-wise, if you rush through the game as fast as possible, you could probably beat it in 20 to 30 hours. I don't think I've ever gotten to the final chapter in under 110, because I'm always running around taking photos of things, trying to find all the scoops, trying to recruit all the settlers, trying to upgrade my weapons, trying to customize my weapons, trying to make Steve the greatest Steambot robot of all time, customizing my villages as much as I possibly can, trying to beat all the many challenges that each single level presents to you, and every single bit of this is highly rewarding. Dark Cloud 2's presentation is tremendous. Visually, it takes a cel-shaded sort of style, which means it's visually timeless and will always look quite good. And there's tons of unique little animations that each enemy has. And the game actually rewards you for paying attention to this because many of them actually have specific photos to take. The audio design is tremendous. The soundtrack is pretty damn amazing, from the combat theme to just the fishing theme. They all work for what they need to do and they all sound great. I'd also like to point out that the voice acting is excellent. There's a decent number of pretty well-known voice actors in this game as well, such as Scott Menville playing Max, Paul Eating playing Cedric the Mechanic, and I don't think I could ever live with myself if I reviewed a game voiced by him without mentioning the legendary Cam Clark. And sure, while there's tons of other voice actors in this game I'm not wildly familiar with, they all do an excellent job. And they really bring each individual unique character to life. And that is Dark Cloud 2. Or in literally every other region, Dark Chronicle. It's right up there on my list with Steambot Chronicles for what could easily be considered the best PS2 game. Do I think it's the singular best one? Well, if I had to make that decision right now, I'd still probably side with Steambot Chronicles. But I can say without hesitation, if you like dungeon crawling or you like action RPGs, you need this game in your library, because while I haven't played every single RPG on the PS2, this one is probably bar none my favorite. It's got an impressively lengthy campaign and just an insane amount of content to bring you back for more. The biggest problem is Dark Cloud 2 is kind of a rare and hard to find game. Last time I looked on eBay, it was going pretty steadily for about $80, and while that is a hefty price, I'd say it is worth it. But if you like action RPGs, if you like dungeon crawling, if you like fun, well-polished, well-designed games, if you like just having an insane amount of content, get this game. It's a no-brainer. Because while there might be many PS2 games, there's only one Dark Cloud 2.
That was the first time I had seen it. The sky that reached so far away, so far above, the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. But I was yet to realize that great changes were happening in the world. Cedric, what are you doing here?
Ha! What you think? You surprised? The Blackstone Railroad's back and ready for action. We're gonna see the world on this baby. Max, we got quite an adventure ahead of us. Hop on so we can hit the road.